What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I hope we're all doing well. In this video, I am going to be giving my thoughts on the Acolyte. Now, quick disclaimer before we get going here, I'll just tell you guys right off the bat, I wasn't a big fan of this show, so if you aren't interested in hearing a take from that perspective, then this probably isn't the video for you. With that being said, I do sincerely hope that you enjoyed the Acolyte. I'm happy for all who liked the series, and I really do wish that I felt the same way, but unfortunately, I don't. It had a few good things that I did enjoy, and I will touch on those moments, but largely most of this show just didn't do it for me. Despite my disappointment, I will say that I do feel like the show's cancellation comes across as a bit of a premature knee-jerk reaction, which causes me to question the mindset of those who greenlit the series in the first place, but perhaps that will be another conversation for another time. In this video, we're just going to try and focus on the events of the series itself. So, The Acolyte is probably the most controversial Star Wars series, and as someone who has been a fan of most things Star Wars under Disney, I'm not ecstatic to say that I wasn't a fan. But the writing to me often felt choppy and forced. The characters were inconsistent, the Jedi's behavior was just off at times, and seemed to contradict the foundational characteristics of who the Jedi are supposed to be in the galaxy. This is supposed to be a time when the Jedi are not only at the height of their powers, but also when they are far less corrupt than the Jedi we see in the prequel trilogy. The Jedi are not the villains, they're not the bad guys, and there shouldn't be any gray area around that. They are the heroes. Now, do said heroes make mistakes at times? Sure. But I often felt that this show was trying to cast an unnecessarily dark shadow on the Jedi Order, and it didn't really sit right with me. The nature of the Jedi seems to have been jeopardized and challenged in this show in a way that it never should have been. Now, I do understand that the Acolyte was marketed as a story that would delve into the Sith point of view, and that inherently suggests that we might come to sympathize with them to some degree at some point in the story, which is totally fine. I think it's a cool concept, actually. But by the end, the story still needs to make it clear that the dark side is bad, and instead, I feel like the writers left their stance on that concept somewhat open-ended, and that's simply not how it should be. The light is good, the Jedi are good, the dark is bad, the Sith are the villains. And while it's fine for there to be moments where we sit there and we say, you know what, I can reason with this villain or that villain, we should never walk away from the story wondering if they're actually the good guys. And if you look at this story in isolation, you could easily step away not knowing who the good and bad guys really are. I feel like the only reason we really know who's right and wrong in the Acolyte is because of the stories that exist outside of it. Now, this show's interaction or potential interference with the lore is a topic that I will come back to because I do have several other issues, but a larger problem that I have with this series is actually just more about the overall quality and purpose of the story. I still don't really understand why this story was being told. And don't get me wrong, it's fine to tell stories that are entirely separate from the Skywalker saga. In fact, it may be a necessary thing to do if Star Wars is going to survive to keep telling stories. But this show isn't actually that. It's not a completely separate thing. It takes place too close to the prequels to operate in isolation, and it intentionally introduces characters who are a part of that story, but then still seems to attempt to proceed as if it's an entirely separate thing, and that creates trouble. To me, because this story is set within 100 years of the prequels, and because they went out of their way to introduce a character like Darth Plagueis, this show ultimately just should have been about Darth Plagueis, or at the very least, Plagueis his master. And then from there, we could have went on to meet Plagueis and eventually Sidious. There was no need to introduce a new Sith. We already had one who had never appeared on screen and who people can't wait to see in action. And that's not really an indictment on Kyber. I think he was probably the best character in the series, but there was no need to create him, and even if you did want to create this character, he probably should have been presented as one of the failed apprentices of Plagueis, which he may well have been being set up to be, but I just think the show should have taken a Plagueis-centric point of view early on instead of waiting to do that in later seasons, if that's something that they were planning to do at all. But what may have been my biggest problem with this series was just that I found the main characters of the story very difficult to connect with. Sol was an interesting Jedi, and Kyber was a compelling villain, but their backstories and their motivations always felt surface level. We never dug deep into what was making those characters tick because the story always came back to the true main characters, May and Osha, neither of whom ever held my interest. We got into Sol's motivations a little bit, but the payoff at the end of the supposed mystery fell flat for me. And when it came came to the twins, I was never curious about May and Osha's history, nor where their story was going, and the time I probably felt the most emotion in a scene that involved them was when Osha killed Sol, and that emotion wasn't for her, it was really just some minor frustration because after what was one of the coolest duels I've ever seen between Sol and Kyber, Sol then died in what I felt was extremely underwhelming fashion. Osha force choking this Jedi Master to death after he just went toe-to-toe with a trained Sith just came off as ridiculous to me, and it certainly didn't help that Osha's palpable emotions didn't appear to match the moment. I had a hard time justifying why Osha would kill Sol here because 1, I don't think the story did a good job building up such a flippant allegiance, and 2, Osha just doesn't appear all that angry as she's channeling the dark side to take out this man who, given the context of the story, she should care quite a bit about. Her flip from light to dark just didn't really make sense. I actually found myself getting into this story several times when it focused on Kyber or on Sol and his other Jedi counterparts, but then the twins would be interjected back into a scene and my interest slowly faded. The entire quote-unquote mystery behind their stories just never appealed to me, maybe because there wasn't actually that much mystery involved. It seemed to me that answers that were supposed to be big question marks for the show came far too easily with little to no challenge, and the story just failed to build up these reveals that should have felt consequential, but ultimately came across as predictable because they were so heavily foreshadowed that they came as no surprise, or in some cases, I simply didn't care because once again, I failed to connect with May or Osha in virtually any capacity. I know that not everyone feels this way, and I think it's great if you really like these two characters, but I found them to be fundamentally uninteresting. Now, I promise that I will get into some positives, but let me elaborate a bit more on the shortfalls of this series first. The witches who raised Osha and May felt like a bland knockoff of the Night Sisters. I will say, however, that the Mother Anastasia, who actually cared about them and wanted to let Osha follow her own path, sparked a little interest at times, and I did feel a little sorry when Sol killed her, even though I do think that his reaction was reasonable, given the fact that he was watching her morph herself into a black cloud of smoke. Next, although the creation of the twins does appear somewhat different from Anakin's conception, I think them being created through some form of force manipulation does take away from the uniqueness of Anakin's story a bit, which is unfortunate because we're talking about the Chosen One who the entire crux of the Star Wars universe is built upon. Anakin was created by the Force, at least in Legends, in retaliation to Plagueis' attempt to bend the Force to his own will. And a major plot point throughout the entire saga is Plagueis and Palpatine's repeated attempts to create Force sensitives. Now, Palpatine does eventually succeed with this, the most powerful Sith Lord in the history of the galaxy. But to have these random witches who we've never heard of before seemingly do what the Sith could not long before Palpatine ever figured it out is a bit off-putting for me. And this is probably part of the reason I don't really like May and Osha. Certain details about their stories led me to write them off and even root against them very early on. Now, I do want to take a step back here and acknowledge what I think the show was ultimately aiming to do with the twins. I think it's somewhat obvious that the witch's creation of May and Osha was being set up as Plagueis' inspiration to try to create his own embodiment of the Force, which ultimately resulted in the Force retaliating and creating Anakin. And I don't hate that concept. I'm aware that some people don't like that idea because they're just entirely opposed to a legend like Plagueis being motivated or inspired by this weird group of witches, which I kind of get, but I wouldn't be entirely against it. We have to be open enough to new ideas to let stories like the Acolyte breathe, and that sort of change, or I guess it's more of just a revelation, isn't a deal breaker to me. And that brings me to acknowledge something else. If season 2 of this show was just going to continue to focus on May, Osha, and Kyber while utilizing Plagueis as little more than a mysterious background character, I don't think I'd be all that interested. However, if this series was preparing to shift to a Plagueis-heavy story in which he became the main character, or at least a main character, I actually think that was the ideal way to go. It's something I would probably like to see, and it might have saved this entire series. When Plagueis came across the screen, I got excited, and I'm sure a lot of people got excited. I thought it was awesome to see him, as it was something I'd been hoping for throughout the duration of the show. But I also have to say that after seeing him once, I certainly expected him to show up again and do something meaningful before the end of the season, and the fact that he didn't sort of makes his inclusion feel like a pointless force. And you could argue that they were setting up a season 2 storyline, but I would have liked to see him do something that said to the audience, hey, this is why we're showing this guy right now. I find it sort of difficult to definitively judge this show because it was clearly being set up as a multi-season series, and I really try not to judge incomplete stories too hard, but taking season 1 for what it was by itself, I just don't agree with its initial direction. It seems to me that The Acolyte would have been far better off as a Plagueis-centered show from the jump that eventually led to him taking Palpatine as his one true apprentice down the road. And maybe the plan was to go that route eventually, and if it was, that's a bit unfortunate to me because I really think a Darth Plagueis-centric series would go a long way for fans from all corners of the fandom if it was handled effectively. One could easily argue that it was actually smart to build up to Plagueis' story in this way before shifting the story to his perspective, but the rebuttal to that argument would obviously be that throwing nearly $200 million at an entire season of a series and coming away with what many have perceived as a low-quality result is inexcusable, regardless of the larger plan. But as of right now, it doesn't seem like we'll ever know what the long-term plan was anyways, and that makes this entire situation even more unfortunate. Now, moving away from Plagueis, another thing that I wasn't a fan of was the Dyad vibes that we were getting at times early in the series around May and Osha. Because if we were going to go that route, and that is still an if I think, it would take away from the uniqueness of the bond between Rey and Ben Solo. I get that the continued creation of Star Wars content means that certain concepts are going to be repeated, but the Force Dyad and the Immaculate Conception of Anakin Skywalker are two extremely unique concepts that I really feel should be left to stand alone. But now, on to some good things. First and foremost, the lightsaber duels in this series were outstanding, and the cinematography was great. The first duel between Kyber and the group of Jedi was awesome, the flashback where Kelnaka gets possessed by the witches and goes at the Jedi was interesting, and the final battle between Sol and Kyber was better than both of those duels in my opinion. I wouldn't say that that last fight is at the top of my ranking of the best lightsaber duels in Star Wars, but it's probably up there. But next, like I briefly mentioned earlier, I think Sol was a decently written character with some pretty cool moments, and I would probably say that Kyber was the best character in the series. I only wish we had explored his motivations and his backstory a little more. Seeing that season 2 has been cancelled, the chances of exploring his story are obviously not looking great right now, but there are always other means of storytelling, and I would say there's a pretty good chance that, fans who are into this kind of stuff can probably look forward to like a comic or a book or some other form of spin-off that is a lot cheaper for Lucasfilm to make. Next up, at first I thought the light whip lightsaber was kind of dumb, but I do recognize that this is not a newly invented weapon, and it's also kind of a cool and subtle detail that Kyber constructed his Shoto saber specifically to combat his former Jedi Master's light whip. I'm also interested to know what caused his master to turn on him in the manner that she did, according to Kyber, because that's obviously not a very Jedi thing to do without tremendous cause. I'd really like to know what caused her to lash out and give Kyber all those marks that he has on his back. Kyber's helmet is also pretty cool. I personally think it would be interesting if Kyber goes on to create the Knights of Ren, or at least if his helmet goes on to inspire their creation. The latter option probably makes the most sense actually, because ultimately if Plagueis is Kyber's master, which is what we've been told, then Plagueis in all likelihood needs to kill Kyber in order for their story to fit with the prequel lore. One way I could possibly see them working around that though would be for Plagueis to thoroughly overpower and dominate Kyber, showing that he is simply nowhere near the level of a true Dark Lord, but then somehow Kyber escapes, slinks off into the shadows to lick his wounds, and then he goes on to create the Knights of Ren. But now, moving toward the end of the final episode, there are two more points I want to address there. First, seeing a character bleed a Kyber crystal on screen was actually very cool. That's a concept that I've always liked, and I wish that was all I had to say about it. However, I feel like it was executed very poorly. Bleeding a Kyber crystal, as far as I understand it, is supposed to be an act that requires a tremendous amount of rage. It's one of those actions that symbolizes someone's commitment to the dark side. But Osha, first of all, again, doesn't look all that angry in this scene, and second, in a matter of a few seconds, she was suddenly refocused on the story they were going to tell the Jedi, as if she wasn't really considering the dark side and was still intent on doing the right thing. And that, to me, is just not how that should have gone down, and that's also part of the reason why her force-choking soul fell so flat. Osha just felt like a very, very inconsistent character to me, whose actions were somehow highly predictable, maybe because I could tell what the story wanted to do before it did it a lot of the time, but also a character whose actions felt generally unearned or unwarranted and, alas, underwhelming. And the other point in this episode, I don't know if they were trying to build some sort of romance between Osha and Kyber or what that scene at the end was all about. This isn't like a huge gripe for me, I don't really care, but it did seem kinda weird. I've heard there was some sort of attempted parallel between that and Reylo, but I do not view those situations as comparable at all. Rey and Ben's coming together at the end of The Rise of Skywalker felt like it had been earned in a lot of ways. There was a physical and romantic tension between the two, which built throughout the trilogy. But it's also worth acknowledging that it could have been, like a contrast to Rey and Ben. Rey and Ben came together in the light through the qualities that are represented by the light side of the Force, peace, love, and then you had Kyber and Osha coming together and their bond or their relationship or their romance, whatever it was ultimately supposed to be, comes from the dark side, manipulation, anger, deals between two characters that seem to exploit one of the characters even though they're mutually beneficial in some way. So again, that's not a huge problem for me. I don't really know where they were going to go with it, but I don't know how to feel about it. And one more point about this show, I know that this has been beaten up all over social media already, but the 2 flashback episodes felt like a massive waste of time to me, especially in an 8-episode series. They didn't really tell us much that we didn't already know, and I really didn't see the point. But on that note, I digress. I've only watched this series one time, so perhaps a second viewing would reveal some things to me that I am presently unaware of, although I am a little less keen to do so right now given that Season 2 has been canceled. At the end of the day, let me make this clear. I was not upset about The Acolyte. As I said in the beginning, I have enjoyed the majority of Star Wars content Disney has produced over the years, and so if a project misses the mark here or there, it's okay, life goes on. I don't expect to love every show and movie, and I respect that everyone is taking these stories in through their own unique lenses. So a story that I don't love might be a life-changing experience for the next person, and that's cool. It's perfectly acceptable to not like every Star Wars show. It's fine if you dislike most or even all Star Wars content. What I don't like to see is people telling others what they can or can't like. That's where we run into problems, and that's never what I intend to do here. But in the big picture, there are usually some positives to take away from each story we get. In most cases, the good far outweighs the bad. And then, every once in a while, you get that story that really snatches your heart. You meet that character who you're suddenly rooting for with every muscle in your body. You sit in your seat with tears in your eyes. You walk out of the theater jumping with excitement. And those stories are what it's all about. Those stories are worth waiting for, and those stories never die. For you, The Acolyte may be one of those stories. It may be Attack of the Clones for another person, Return of the Jedi for another, and for someone else, each and every Star Wars project may speak to them in a magical way. No matter what, we're all here because a Star Wars story at some point or another meant something to us, and that's what this fandom is all about. So, if you enjoyed The Acolyte, great. If you didn't, great. Either way, if you're still here, thank you for sticking around to the end. I hope you all have an amazing day, night, week, month, year. Enjoy your life, do something epic today, and remember, the Force will be with you, always.